today's programme, a trip through time to the golden age of the silver screen. Autographed photographs reveal how a star from the East rose in the West against all odds. But first, Taunton in Somerset, where a miniature painting would tell the remarkable story of a larger-than-life 19th century artist. It all began when Hilary Bush paid a visit to an antiques fair in Birmingham.
I saw this miniature and it was very attractive because it was colourful. She's an unusual, obviously flamboyant lady with a turban and a red dress. And having had a look at that, it says on the label that she was a lady called Sarah Biffin. She piqued my interest and I actually wanted to find more about her. She's much more colourful than the normal run of miniatures that one sees, and she obviously looked as if she was an interesting person. Plus, on the label, it said she was a painter without arms. So the quality of the work on the painting actually is quite astounding, considering she must have done it with her mouth. I'd really like to know a little more about her, what happened to her, where did she go, did she leave Somerset? I mean, this whole painting was not bought in Somerset, so obviously she must have travelled around. What happened to her? Did she get married? And when did she die? Where did she live? What did she do?
At first, our investigation remained focused in Somerset. We learned that the subject of the miniature self-portrait, the colourful and apparently successful Miss Sarah Biffin, was the child of poor farm workers from the village of East Quantock's Head. The middle of 5 children, she was born in 1784 with neither arms nor legs, a condition called phocomelia.
In Sarah's time, it was probably blanket making as a cottage industry that caused this phocomelia problem, and it would be some of the chemicals or the constituents that they used in the blanket making process that perhaps were absorbed into the mother's skin and then affected the child while it was forming in the womb.
But Sarah Biffin was nothing if not determined.
When she was 8 years old, she actually asked her mother if her mother could teach her to do needlework. Her mother told her not to bother trying, it would only upset her. So when her parents were out, which would be, especially during the summer months, would be sort of all those hours of daylight, they'd be out working in the fields. Sarah contrived at home to find her own ways of making clothes for herself. So she taught herself to thread a needle. She taught herself to use scissors with her mouth, and by the time she was 12 years old, she was actually making her own clothes, which is amazing. When no hands, no arms, no legs, no toes or anything to manipulate a needle with. All of this she did off her own back, teaching herself how to do it.
The difficulties of raising a disabled child 2 centuries ago were intense, especially for a family without money or connections. In 1797, what appeared to be a solution to the plights of both Sarah and her family arrived in the form of a travelling showman.
Emmanuel Jukes travelled the country with a fairground freak show, so the world's strongest man, the bearded lady, Siamese twins, anything like that, any sort of anything that could be described as a freak. Sarah's parents realised that here was some potential for their daughter. This may sound very hard by today's standards, but what they had in mind, having met Emmanuel Jukes, that here was a possibility that Sarah could join the freak show. She could travel the country with Emmanuel Jukes, demonstrating her ability to make clothes with her mouth, to write competent letters with her mouth, and here would be a source of income, a source of financial independence that they would never be able to offer. So although it sounds hard, certainly by today's standards, her parents effectively sold Sarah at the age of 13 to Emmanuel Jukes, and that then set the course for the rest of her life.
Sarah Biffin was billed as the 8th wonder of the world. For 4 years, she amazed audiences by threading needles, cutting cloth and making clothes. But eventually the enthusiasm of the show going public began to wane.
Realising that her act was becoming stale, she decided that perhaps it was the time to learn to paint, and Emmanuel Jukes, who was a bit of an artist himself, decided to teach her to paint. And that was Sarah's main breakthrough then. That really was the opportunity that was to get her out of the fairgrounds. She travelled the country then painting miniature portraits, mostly on ivory, so for brooches, perhaps. So very much for people that had quite a bit of money to spare. During the years that she was painting those miniatures, for which Emmanuel Jukes was paid 3 guineas at a time, Sarah got nothing from that money. Sarah got 5 guineas a year from the time she joined the fairgrounds to the time she finished. So although Emmanuel Jukes was making more and more money, Sarah wasn't. Sarah had a loop, a simple little sort of tucked over piece, into which she would stick the end of the paintbrush. Then she would hold the paintbrush in her mouth, and then by manipulating the paintbrush that way, so one end on her shoulder, halfway along in her mouth. If you just think about how practical it is to control the fine detail at the end of a paintbrush when you're holding it in your mouth, something like that is absolutely amazing.
Sarah learned quickly. Just 5 months after she began painting in 1803, she was producing miniatures that were said to match any by established artists. And 5 years later, at St. Bartholomew's Fair in London, an encounter with a sceptical aristocrat would transform her life.
The Earl of Morton arrived, spotted Sarah and saw the way that she was painting, and realised that the particular miniature portrait she just completed was of such a high standard, he thought it highly unlikely that Sarah had actually painted it herself. So he made the decision that he would sit for his own portrait, and this would involve a number of sittings. And at the end of each sitting, the Earl of Morton took the portrait away in order that no one else could be contributing to it. And when the piece was finished, he knew it was entirely Sarah's own work.
The Earl promoted Sarah within the court of King George, and she was taken under a royal wing. Reluctantly, she left the security of Emmanuel Jukes, and soon she was painting the British and Dutch royal families, as well as numerous aristocrats. Her work was much respected and remains so today.
Portraits by Sarah Biffin are relatively rare. I think there are about 72 portrait miniatures so far recorded by her. In 8 years, I've probably sold about 3 portrait miniatures at auction by her, so they're reasonably rare. Like other 19th century artists, Sarah produced different types of painting. We know that she experimented in oil, pencil and watercolour, as well as producing miniatures. And the whole technique of miniature painting is a very difficult one at this stage. Artists are trying to make a water-based paint, watercolour, stay on the surface of ivory, which is naturally oily. By the time Sarah Biffin was painting, she could buy prepared pieces of ivory, but it's still very difficult. The paint actually slides around and slips off unless you have a particular technique. So just conquering that technique was difficult enough for most people. So it's incredible that she managed it with her mouth. Miniature painting was not only popular, but it was very necessary. People needed portable portraits just as we need photographs today, and they would have been exchanged between lovers when people became betrothed, when people died. You get a lot of mothers wearing portraits of children on bracelets as part of their mourning jewellery. Child mortality rate is extremely high. Sarah herself lived to 66, which is remarkable in that period, but she may have had commissions for portraits for mourning purposes, so very, very popular. She exhibited at the Royal Academy under her maiden name Biffin and her married name Wright, and her work would have been exhibited alongside artists such as Sir William Charles Ross, who painted this portrait of Lady Caroline Holland, and he was the official portrait miniaturist for Queen Victoria. So her work must have been good enough to be placed alongside these other portrait miniatures, which is incredible considering her disabilities.
Sarah became a prominent personality. She is mentioned casually in not just 1, but 4 of Charles Dickens' novels, the author assuming that all his readers would be familiar with her. But her life was about to take a tragic turn, which began with what should have been a joyous occasion, her marriage.
At the age of 40, she falls in love with a bank clerk called William Stephen Wright. Now, he was 16 years her younger, and it does beg the question, why would a 24-year-old bank clerk fall in love with a 40-year-old lady? And just maybe the attraction was her money. And that certainly proved to be the case, because within a couple of weeks of them being married, he persuaded her to hand over all of her wealth to him to look after, on the assumption that as a bank clerk he wouldn't best know what to do with it. But it wasn't very long before he had disappeared, taken all of her money with him. Initially, there was £40 a year being paid to her by William Wright, but eventually, it wasn't very long before that stopped. So all of the wealth that she managed to acquire has now disappeared along with her husband.
As a result, Sarah's life turned full circle. Her patron, the Earl of Morton, died, and her connection to the royal household was broken. To make matters worse, her health was declining. She returned briefly to the travelling fairs but couldn't cope. In a last attempt to re-establish herself, she moved to Liverpool, but died soon after. Her gravestone, once here in the shadow of the Anglican Cathedral, has long since disappeared.
It's a story that starts in poverty with an agricultural family, labouring family. She'd risen to the dizzy heights of working with kings and queens of England, and then slipped all the way back down again. So a tremendous story in terms of her courage and overcoming those dreadful disabilities that she had. And what a shame there was no one there to just keep that eye on her as she came into her final years.
That portrait will have a pride of place in the house, because she's certainly such an achiever. It was well worth buying it and making that exploration into her past, and of such a determination. No wonder her dress and her demeanour was so flamboyant. She certainly worked hard to earn that. So it's nice to have the complete story about a life that's so full of highs and lows.